There are many different techniques that you can use when crazy quilting, or today it's often referred to as freeform quilting. This video is where I recommend you begin. I'll show you how to use fabric strips or scraps and straight line piecing to complete a block. To begin, we'll look at fabric choice. Here are 3 blocks made with strips and straight line sewing. Using solids can give you more of a clean look. Mixing different plaids jazzes it up a bit. The same strip technique is used in this 3rd block, but trim was also added. I could go further by adding embroidery to that last block, but I think you can see that the craziness of your block can be upgraded by your fabric choices and by adding embellishments. Before I start, I like to have an idea of how big my piece needs to be. For this video, I've decided to use a 6x8 rectangle, but you can try any size. I like to make a frame so I can view the piece. I keep this nearby my workspace. It's not necessary, but it's a useful tool. To make my block, I'll need some strips. In crazy or freeform quilting, there's no set pattern to follow, so there is no set size to cut. But I usually find strips 1 to up to about 3 inches wide work the best. You don't have to measure or be precise. That's why this method of quilting is so relaxing and fun. Now these strips are leftovers from past projects. They've been pressed. Always make sure to press your fabric, and they're ready to be trimmed. All I need is just one straight edge on my strip. Let me look at this gold strip. It looks like there's a nice clean edge. Now this one has some messy edges. So let me just go in, take my rotary cutter, and just trim that edge. You also don't have to worry that the strip is the same width throughout. You just need one straight edge that you'll follow when sewing. Let's talk about how long to cut your strips. You will be sewing strips together. You may want the strips to go in this direction, or you might decide you like them in this direction. Either way's okay. It's up to you to decide what you like best. The length of your strips should be longer than you need, at least 1 to 2 inches longer. Let me give you an example to show you what I mean by the strip length should be longer. This strip, if it's going across in this direction, if I cut it exactly or close to that length, and remember, we don't have to be precise, but if I cut it this size, it fits, but I might want to put it at an angle, and if I put it on an angle, it's not going to be long enough to go across this piece. So if I cut my strips a little bit longer, 1 inch to 2 inches on each edge, then I'm going to have strips long enough that if I decide to put it on an angle like that or put it on an angle like that, it'll be long enough to cover my rectangle. You don't have to worry so much about the size or the length of these strips. If your piece ends up to be too narrow, later on I'm going to show you how to fix this. If you're starting with new fabric, you're going to cut your strips about 1 to 3 inches wide. You don't have to measure, be precise, just make sure you get one straight edge. So let's see, I'll cut about 2-inch strips. There you go. If you don't have a rotary cutter, you can use a ruler to mark a straight line on your fabric and then just use your scissors to cut that line. Here are the strips or scraps that I might use in my piece. I like to try some out, and once I get a grouping that's pleasing to me, I take a photo so I can use it as a guide when sewing. I also want to check to make sure that this would fit on my 6x8. I can put it like this. If I want to go this way, I might not be able to make it. It's easiest for me to try it using this frame. So if I decide to go this way, it would probably fit, and if I decide to go that way, it would probably fit. So I'm ready to go over to the sewing machine now. When sewing, you can either start at the top, the bottom, or in the middle. I prefer to start in the middle. I'm not quite sure why, but anywhere you decide to start is fine. So let me pick up these 2 right here, and I'll put right sides together, and I notice this isn't such a straight edge, so let me turn this so that we've got a straight edge here, and I wanted it at an angle, so maybe I'll put it at an angle like so. Here's my straight edge, but since this was a scrap, I don't have much fabric down here, so it's not going to be able to go the full length of that, but it'll work out just fine. I can pin this if I want to. I'll start out pinning. Maybe one at either end and one in the middle. I'm using red thread so you can see. You'll want to use a neutral colored thread. I'm also using a regular stitch length. The edge of my pressure foot will act as a guide for sewing my seam allowance. I have a 1/4 inch foot, so my seams will be a 1/4 inch wide. If your foot is wider, your seams will be wider. When crazy quilting, you get to decide on your personal seam allowance. I like to use a little scrap of fabric for what I call a leader or feeder to get started. Put that under and I just sew on that, and I'm going to start sewing on my 2 pieces of fabric. Let me take this out. Here's my pressure foot, and I will use that as a guide to come right down here along this straight edge of the fabric. Make sure you take your pins out when you're sewing. Before I take this to be pressed, I like to trim this excess. Now I could use my rotary cutter, but when I'm sitting down like this, I just use my scissors. I'll just follow that seam allowance line. Ooh, I wasn't too straight there. It'll be okay, but you really want to try to have a straight line when you sew. I've pressed my strips and I'm ready to add the next strip. I decided that this would look good here, but I want it at an angle. Now I could take this over to the sewing machine and sew that seam allowance right down the edge here like I did on the last piece. But another way to work with this is to take your rotary cutter, and I need to back it up just a little. Now remember I said this isn't precise. I think I'm going to lose that right there. So let me trim that off. I think that's where I'd like that strip to be. Put right sides together, pin this, or I like to just hold it with my hands now and take this over to the sewing machine to be sewn. I've sewn my seam, pressed it, and I'm ready to add my next piece. I'm going to continue at an angle. I like this piece like this. So I have the choice. I can either flip it over, sew that 1/4 inch seam, or I can trim this off. I think I'll trim this down. Make it, I think that's a little bit easier way to go. So let me get this here. Now remember, it's not going to be precise. If I want it to be exactly like that, I have to allow for some seam allowance. So maybe I'll back it up a little. And I want to make sure I catch this in. So there. Oops. I'll put right sides together. I didn't cut this out. It's okay if you want to put the selvage in a crazy quilt, but I really don't want it in this piece, so I'll move that down a little. Line this up. I'm going to use my presser foot to sew along the straight edge. I'm not going to use pins because I usually don't like to use pins. If you feel more comfortable using pins, it's okay, but it's not necessary. So let me double check, make sure that this is all lined up, just coming right along the side here. Before adding another piece, I need to press. I've added some more strips, and I would continue adding strips until it gets large enough to cover my rectangle. I'm almost ready to cut this down to size. Here's my 6x8 rectangle. You see I'm maybe a little short here if I want to put it that way, but I definitely have enough fabric if I position it this way. So this is where that frame comes in handy. I can't really see underneath here. So let me move that and let's look at the frame. So if I were to put it this way, I'd be a little short up there, but I could probably put another piece over there. So let me try it the other way. or almost fitting this way. I just need a little extra down here. After fooling with this a bit, I think I like it best this way. I'm a little short here, but that's okay. I'll show you what's going to happen after we cut this out. I'll put this 6x8 piece back in here, take this away, then I'll use my rotary cutter and my ruler to cut this out. So let's see what we've got after everything's been cut away. I'm still missing a little edge here, but I can bring this piece in and add it to that corner. If I don't like the way it looks, I can just cut it up. So let me cut this off. Right sides together. Take it over to the sewing machine and stitch that seam. Here's my completed block. You could use this to make a mug rug or a pot holder. Maybe you want to make a small pillow out of it, or you might decide to make more blocks and you could sew them all together into a much larger quilt. If you'd like to learn more crazy or freeform quilting techniques, such as what to do with all these leftover scraps, check out our beginner basics section. Click on Crazy or Freeform Quilting. In our small projects section, you'll find directions for making these greeting cards. Thanks for visiting LearnHowToQuilt.com. Please share our videos with your friends.